Welcome everybody to the Heart Coherence Collaborative. We're so excited. We have Teal Swan with us today. I am incredibly excited to be asking some questions of things that I need help with. We've been watching your videos for a long time now, so we're super just pumped up to dive in and see what you have to offer us. So thank you for being here. Leah's going to read your bio and then we'll get after it.
Okay. Teal Swan's mission is the transformation of human suffering to an empowered and authentic life. She is the creator of the popular Ask Teal YouTube series, author of 6 internationally published books, and the artist of hundreds of frequency paintings, one of which is behind her. In conjunction with her vision of creating positive world change, Teal Swan founded Headway Foundation, a nonprofit that enables ideas, goals, and ventures that are aimed at positive world change.
Welcome.
Welcome.
That was a really good introduction. Thank you.
Nice.
Good.
All right, so now we're going to just dive in. It's going to get real. So in life, you go about life, you're out in public, somebody will treat you a certain way. You don't respond problematically, you smile, no big deal. But then in your relationship, your partner does the same thing and you freak out. How do you go about decreasing reactivity in intimate relationships?
The question I would ask is why are you wanting that? Like, what is the overall intention of decreasing reactivity from your perspective in your relationship?
I don't want to be a psycho. Yeah, well, no, it's not healthy. So how I'm responding is not good. It seems like it's creating chaos and distance from my partner and I.
Okay, so the biggest mistake that people make when they are thinking about reactivity is that they think it's possible to be non-reactive.
Yeah.
And what I want people to understand is that those reactions are so like ABC, they happen so instantaneously that it's not something that you can just decide not to do, right? Any more than you can decide to not have your parasympathetic nervous system basically shift into completely high gear when there's like a bus traveling towards you on a highway.
Yeah.
What you have to do is to respond to your own reaction. And I'm telling you, like, it may sound like I'm splitting hairs here, but it makes all the difference in the universe. Because the expectation to not react means you're in resistance to your reactivity, which just does nothing but increase your reactivity.
Right.
So the attitude we have to have towards our reactivity is, this is happening for a really valid reason. This should be happening because it's happening. Now, when you're in that state, you have the capacity to respond to it. And by response, I mean to caretake your own reactivity. It's almost like you shift into the subjective space where you are both the witnesser and the one reacting. If you're currently in this witnessing perspective of the reactivity itself, you're in a perspective that can caretake that reactivity a bit like a parent would caretake a child's reactivity. Now, the first thing that you do from that objective place relative to your own reaction is, why am I having this reaction? You seek to understand it. The same as you would with a toddler who's panicking, right? If you have a toddler throwing a fit, we need to seek to understand why this is happening first and foremost, right? Now, the understanding of why it is occurring and maybe what perception a person is in to have that reaction be so severe enables us to understand what action we can take to remedy, that feeling or that personal truth that we have. So let's say that when you're turning into this sort of caretaking mentality, when you're using the caretaking mentality towards that aspect of you that's reacting, you may find out that, well, I'm reacting like this because they don't respect me. Okay, well then from there you have an action that gives you the action plan. Maybe it needs to be a discussion about respect. Now, a discussion about respect is very different than where most people would go if all they do is simply react rather than caretake their own reaction. Because, if we're just simply reacting, it's about the moment. Why did you step on my toes just then? It's ridiculous to step on my toes, right? Or whatever it is. Now, if we understand that the real thing behind that reaction is the fact that we feel disrespected, suddenly that's a different conversation. I feel disrespect. Okay, well, what does respect mean to you? This is what it means to me. Well, then if you want my respect, this is the kind of way you need to behave. Okay, then now I have some empowerment around this.
And then if you have that conversation and then somebody's still not reacting or treating you the way you want, even though you've you know, kind of explained your terms of how you wanted to be treated, how then do you communicate from there?
You bring that up to them directly.
Yeah.
I have communicated to you several times about this.
Mm,
So it seems that no matter what I do, this is an unworkable pattern within you because you are not changing it. Why is it that you are not changing it no matter what I do?
mm,
So maybe based on what they say, that's your different action, right? What needs to happen next. Now, potentially you run into a situation, this is really worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, you run into a situation where you are up against genuine unworkability in that somebody's behavior will not change no matter what. End of story.
mm.
That's where acceptance comes into play. Now, acceptance is a funny thing because people don't understand it. I mean, honestly, people think acceptance and they think things like, well, you just have to accept that dad's a drinker and just love him the way he is. And, you know, that's not what I'm saying in terms of acceptance. Acceptance is literally just I'm swallowing the reality. Now, what you'll find is that oftentimes when we get into these types of conflicts, we are refusing to accept something that is unchangeable. And when we accept the reality, all of a sudden we're in a choice point. And that choice point might be, I find ways to become okay with this, or it might be, actually, my personal boundary is I don't want to be around that. And I choose something else for my life.
Mm.
So compatibility, definitely, I'm pretty sure we're going to touch on that multiple times in this conversation. Compatibility is definitely very important when it comes to that worst case scenario where you have to accept something and someone for exactly how they're going to be and going to stay.
Nice. All right, well, we started off with some fire.
We did. So I think I would like to, since we really love to talk about the heart here, to know what your perspective is on the role of the heart in these kind of transformations and in transformations in general.
Okay, well, from my perspective, of course, I'm coming at you from the perspective of somebody who's got like a clairsentient type of a relationship to the universe, right? The heart is really the center for affectional consciousness. So you could think of it like there's two brain centers in your being. What we think of as the mind center as being one of them, the heart as being the other center. But that affectional center of consciousness is more about emotions. It's more about the perceptual awareness, which we call feeling. It's more about love. It's more about connection. And it's more about authenticity and personal truth. So the heart, for me, what makes me the most interested in it is definitely the center for personal truth, which is why it plays such a role in transformation. Because transformation, I mean, we use that word all the time, we kind of toss it around, but to transform is to change. And whenever we use the word transform, we mean dramatic positive change. Dramatic positive change happens when somebody is tapping into the core of their personal truth. You can't have dramatic personal change in a positive way without having that core personal truth. And the heart is the center of that, which is why when you hear people say things like, follow your heart, that means tap into the core of yourself and the truth that is contained within that self and use the way you feel to dictate your course through life.
That is
I like
such a phenomenal perspective on the heart that we haven't heard before. So one thing that's coming up a lot in my observations in life right now is a lot of my friends are struggling because they're specifically isolated. And for whatever reason, it's like their isolation is feeding their isolation. And no matter how hard they try, they can't connect with groups. But as soon as they do, even if it's like miserable, they start to heal. So how does somebody that's struggling with isolation reestablish like the ability to connect with others? And like, what is the difference between isolation and connection on our healing journey?
Wow. We're going in two different
Yeah, sorry, I threw in two questions there. So
let's start with the first one.
all right.
Connection is a natural state for a human being. So connection is not something that you need to essentially elicit out of your being. If we have somebody who is perpetually stuck in isolation, it is because they have adapted a coping mechanism to deal with painful relational trauma. What that means is that where we have to look to reestablish connection is to resolve the resistance within somebody to connecting. So a lot of times when I mean, you're going to get nowhere when you get a person who's like really in these isolation patterns and just try to force them to understand or try to force them to, you know, be in a room with other people or any of those steps that we might intuitively take if we're trying to teach somebody to connect. Like it will go nowhere because you have not dealt with the resistance to doing so, which are, you know, the painful experiences this person has gone through in relationships, the painful stories essentially that they're telling themselves about what happens when they connect and XYZ. And until you find some kind of remedy to those deep insecurities, that will always be a prevention to somebody's capacity to connect. So I'm always one for, you know, the stream naturally moves downstream. So if you're starting to see these huge rapids, there's something in the way. If you take that thing out of the way, there will no longer be that same level of resistance. And then you can work with a person's natural inclination, which is towards connection. And only then are you going to see some really, really good results with things like practicing attunement or emotional expression, or, I mean, any of the tools we could use to enhance connection. So that's the answer to the first question you asked. The second thing is that I'm really, really needing people to understand in a very aggressive way, in fact, that number one, right now in the world, isolation is an absolute epidemic issue.
Yeah.
And I was saying this even before COVID. So you can imagine, like me, I'm writing this book, Anatomy of Loneliness, years before COVID happens. And it's already bad. And then COVID happens and I'm like, you know, over here having a panic attack, right? Because realizing how incredibly damaging that is to a person. Now, something that I want people to be able to do for the sake of their own health is to disidentify far enough to objectively witness themselves. When we disidentify far enough to objectively witness ourselves, we have to look at ourselves as a species, not just like me looking at myself as individual Teal. Let's look at human, right? If we're zooming out to look at the species that is human, what we find is that connection is the single biggest need. It's even more of a deep need. Connection is even more of a deep need, in fact, than food and water. If that was not the case, when people had bad breakups, they would have no problem eating. So, and this is why I'm going to tell you why connection is so essential. Because we are a relationally dependent species. In such an extreme way, people don't even understand how extreme. I mean, if you take a human infant and you just put them outside, that's the end of it. So our entire existence is dependent upon our social bonds. And everything about our species is designed around our social bonds. It's why we are so easily controllable, quite frankly. We're so easily controllable by people in positions of authority when they threaten our social bonds. And that's what shame is all about, right? So even the process of socialization is basically capitalizing on this basic human need. And it doesn't go away. It's not like even when we learn to feed ourselves or whatever it is, we suddenly don't need that connection. It is hardwired into us. It is not possible for us to thrive without it. So the difference between people who are isolated and people who are experiencing connection in terms of their level of health is shocking. And thankfully, this is now being mirrored by science, right? You know, with isolation, let's just see if I can come up with a few things. With isolation, you've got things like a shorter life. You've got obviously higher levels of unhappiness. You've got low self-esteem. You've got cardiovascular issues popping up as a major issue. Reduced sleep, ironically. Sleep, it turns out, is influenced immensely by how connected a person feels in their life. Reduced immune function is perhaps the thing that interests me the very most. Because, I mean, you watch just dramatically shorter lives when you're looking at people who are isolated in any way. And let's not talk about insanity, you know. Okay, so on the connection side, right, when you find that there's people who are deeply connected, you obviously have that longer lifespan. You watch dramatically increased immune function, much lower blood pressure, the capacity for empathy. Isolated individuals essentially have no way to live but to cope by going into an isolated narcissistic bubble. So they're behaving in a more narcissistic way. The more connected an individual is, the more you watch empathy centers in the brain react, right? Much better sleep, and that's a very big deal because sleep does so much for your brain, so much for your body. Oh yeah, and that sensation of satiation, right? Because this is a need. Now, it's really idiocy to think that a human being or any species can thrive without a need being met. I mean, it makes sense to us with everything else. If I have a little sapling and I don't water it, it's not going to grow. But with us, we're like, no, we can live without the need. No, you can't. There's a level of satiation, a level of well-being on a physical, mental, and emotional level that comes with connection, which, quite frankly, people have got to stop denying. So.
Yeah. Wow. So
That-
powerful.
Yeah, and that leads me into the next question, which you started talking a little bit about narcissists.
Mhm.
Well, I feel like this is such a hot topic. I feel like every girl I know on Facebook just broke up with a narcissist. Like, it can't be true, right?
No,
Like,
it's not. I'll tell you why it's not true if you would like.
I would love to hear that, and then I'll have another question. Yeah.
All right, so in a relationship, I'm like strapping in my.
Strap in for the narcissism question.
All right, so in a relationship, we obviously, I just talked a whole big game here about the fact that we desperately need relationships, right? But we also are wired for survival. Like, I don't need to sort of argue. I mean, nobody can argue with that, right? You can feel it in yourself. You feel yourself sort of react to a threat, right? So if we're in a relationship and something in that relationship causes us to feel unsafe, then all of a sudden we shift into self-preservation mode.
Mm-hmm.
Self-preservation mode is an interesting thing because, I mean, if you think about the consciousness in that it can fragment, meaning, let's say something traumatic happens, in that moment, you've got a part of you that's vulnerable in that moment and a part, like a resource within, we could think of them as a separate internal part that can come forward and protect you. When we feel threatened in a relationship, we feel unsafe in some way. Those parts of ourself that are in charge of self-preservation step forward and take over the system. Now, the thing about these protectors is they're incredibly narcissistic. And that's in everybody. There's no exceptions to this. They're narcissistic in their strategies. Now, I am even going to go so far as to say, even when you watch somebody in a relationship exhibit self-sacrificing behaviors, there actually is no such thing. What's happening is there's a protector part that's convinced that behaving in that way is what keeps them the most safe. So it's still a self-centered strategy. So if we understand that when we feel unsafe in a relationship and the parts of ourselves that are in charge of self-preservation step forward and take over in the relationship and they are narcissistic by nature, then all of a sudden what you start to see is a zero-sum game being played by the individual who is feeling unsafe. I'm thinking about me, not the other person right now. Now that triggers the same thing in the other person. Well, now you're behaving in a way that's unsafe to me. And now that I'm unsafe, my parts that are in charge of self-preservation are going to step forward. And now they're in charge. And now what you watch is this absolute spiral of zero-sum game behavior in relationships, which is why pretty much, I mean, when relationships fall apart, because this is the number one reason that they fall apart, people are basically, everybody feels like the other one's the narcissist. They're acting completely against best interest. Yeah, because in that moment, the level of unsafety was ramped up to such an extreme degree in the relationship that those protectors who behave narcissistically were forward in them both. Okay, so that's your answer as to why everybody thinks that they just broke up with a narcissist.
Thank you. That was really interesting and well said. And I think my original question was going to be true narcissist, like a real narcissist. Okay. Can they actually heal?
Yes, and I actually go completely against mainstream psychology in saying that they can. Because when we look at most of these things that we are labeling as a mental illness, what they are is adaptations. We see them as maladaptations, but only because we're observing a person within the context of a normal social environment. We're not observing them within the context of the environment with which that behavior was developed. So if we look at all of these types of personality disorders and whatever we want to call them as an adaptation, that means that there was some origin for that behavior. It just so happens I can tell you what that is for narcissistic behavior. In a dysfunctional home, the modus operandi of the family is every man for himself. You gotta not be taken away by the gaslight that's on top of those families, because those families often, say things like, I do everything for my children are everything for me. And so you're almost getting gaslit on the surface level, but underneath that, it's literally everybody's just doing everything for themselves. Now we see this, obviously, remember how I described what happens in relationships when we're feeling unsafe, right? in a dysfunctional home, it breeds another dysfunctional home because the home itself, the way of relating in that home is an unsafe way of relating. So what the kids have to do when they're born into a dysfunctional type of a social dynamic in a home is they have to find a way to adapt. Now, a child will do this in one of two ways. There are more. Okay, but like, let's say one of two ways. One of those ways is to find a way to please the adults in that house so as to get their own needs met. It's still a narcissistic strategy. So codependency is a strategy that is a narcissistic strategy by nature. It's just not being recognized that way. I figured out that if I let go of this aspect of myself and I just do whatever my mom wants me to do and just be her perfect little, girl, for example, then I can get my needs met. It's still every man for himself. But what we watch with individuals that we would essentially label as full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, these are individuals who could not actually adapt within that family system. They could not find a strategy that made it so that they could please somebody so as to get their needs for connection and XYZ met. And so they're essentially functioning more like a reptile functions. Like with reptiles, what we watch is like there's this baby sort of generated out of nowhere, out of an egg, does not have any sort of caretaking, has to fend for itself from day one. And that is the reality for the child who is coping with a narcissistic strategy. Now, because there's no love, because there's no care, down deep underneath everything is this deep level of shame, same as with the codependent. But they're compensating for that. They're compensating for that with a vast array of these adaptive behaviors, which are maladaptive socially. But to understand the narcissist, you have to get that it's an adaptation whereby they go into this, I only care about me because there's only me in this reality and I'm the only one that's out for me. They literally, they've never had the example of somebody taking their best interests. And they don't even think it exists. So it absolutely can be reversed. It has to be reversed, by them experiencing the opposite of what created that adaptive behavior. And not only experiencing the opposite of that, also dealing with the fragmentation that took place as a result of that deep level of shame, which they experienced in their childhood life. And it's not a pretty road. Like, that's what I will tell you. It's not like a snap of the fingers. Redoing relational trauma is incredibly difficult because, quite frankly, most of the time it can only be done to begin with within a therapeutic context. And my big issue, I mean, obviously, like I absolutely love when people are seeing really good therapists. Good therapists are worth their weight in absolute gold. But I'm really wanting to see developmental centers where people can go in-house, because what'll happen and why this sort of progress is so slow is because, let's say you have somebody who's trying to rehabilitate their sort of narcissistic tendencies. They need to be interacting with many people who are giving them the opposite experience from that zero-sum game type life, which they have come to expect in relationships. But is that going to happen, especially if they themselves are causing people to feel so unsafe? It's a self-reinforcing thing. And that's the thing that like oftentimes it can't be a partner or somebody who's directly affected by them that's able to hold that, no matter what you're doing, I'm going to still behave in a way that is considerate of you. And then they kind of grow a little bit of empathy, which they absolutely can do. I've seen it myself. Usually that only happens when you've got a therapist who is, by definition, removed from some degree of impact.
Wow. Yeah, that just blew up like 100 different questions. So
I know,
instead of keep going with that, I'm gonna steer in a different direction. I'm curious. So I'm somebody who, 10 years ago, I was battling with addiction pretty hard.
Yep.
And I was using substances to drown out a lot of my emotions. And since I've gotten sober, clean over 7 years, what I've found is I'm literally just getting addicted to things that are healthy for me instead of things that weren't healthy for me. But in regards to the actual addiction nature that I have, is that something that can be remedied, or am I an addict for life?
That's an interesting question, because it's like the answer I want to give you is like yes and no.
Yeah, which is fine.
The yes being like, where should I go, yes or no? Let me think. So the no, this is where I want to go first with this. When people are labeled as addictive personality types, right? From more of a non-physical perspective, what is happening with those individuals is they have a very fast moving stream of consciousness.
Mm.
I would not have you tame that down for the universe.
Mm.
What I would have you do is to realize that your consciousness functions more like the Grand Canyon River, where it's very fast and it's very focused and it's very intense. And so you're going to have to work with your own mentality and your own personality like somebody would work with the Grand Canyon River, not like it's a little stream. Another way of saying this is, I love this one. This may be a little bit funny. I like to compare people to like breeds of dogs sometimes. And what's difficult is if you live in a society that expects everybody to be like a bulldog, but you're like a Springer Spaniel, right? Then it's like it gets very difficult because it's like everybody's trying to push you sideways of your own nature. Now, what I would have you do is to profoundly recognize your own nature and learn how to work with it and channel it. So when you ask me, am I always going to have, be addicted? No, the addiction for me is completely separate from what you're needing to look at, which is that high degree of intensity and that obsessive nature.
Yeah.
That obsessive nature is an incredible benefit. I mean, Einstein was this way. It's why he came up with all of his theories. He's sitting there like night after night, just like, it's like the Grand Canyon. Yeah. So use it is what I'd say. Are you going to be able to get rid of that? No, nor should you, because we need people within society that are like that. And wherever you channel that, you're going to see massive manifestation. So separate that from the addiction itself. When people with this type of a consciousness stream or a personality don't have a proper way to create an outlet and don't have enough strategies for resolving emotional pain, they have no option but to try to tone it out somehow. But you watch this, even like, let's go back to dogs. When you have a high intensity dog and you stick them in a pen, right? You start to see all these behaviors, and those behaviors can become incredibly detrimental to the dog themselves. You see behaviors like, spinning in circles. You start to see even self-injury, things like that. And I see addiction as nothing but an attempt to regulate that high level of intensity in many individuals, yourself included.
Yeah.
So this one, if you do the right thing with that type of intensity, you don't see the addictions. The addiction only comes in when you can't find another way to try to regulate emotion. And that's what addiction is. Addiction is, I've got this, extreme level of pain. It's not being validated. It's not being understood. I don't know how to regulate it. Nobody's taught me how to do that. And so I have to drink, or I have to take a pill, or I have to shoot something up, or I have to, exercise at 3 a.m. for 2 hours or whatever it is,
Yeah.
But I'm so unconcerned. I'm so unconcerned with addiction in general. Why? Because it's a surface symptom. What we need to learn to do with addictions is to go underneath that surface symptom. And that's incredibly difficult for people who are addicts because of the fact that they don't trust their own capacity to regulate their emotions. So they feel like if I drop down there, all hell's going to break loose. But actually, dropping down there is where the good stuff starts to happen.
Yeah, I've dropped down.
And you're building emotional muscle?
I've taken that dive. That's actually how the Heart Coherence Collaborative came about. So like, instead of the fear, the resentment, find ways to feel gratitude, appreciation. And so that's how this practice came.
Now that's what I would say that is so very powerful about you, is the fact that that same level of intensity can go in the direction of addiction, but that same level of intensity can now go towards this thing, that's now benefiting people around the world and benefiting you.
I love that. And I'm going to share this clip with all my friends in this community, because it makes sense. Like when I was younger, I actually would play basketball for 11 hours a day. Phenomenal basketball player. It was my outlet and I was healthy. But then when like life became serious, like school, being, like do all your homework and go to college, I like didn't know how to channel. Instead of being out in nature doing what I loved, I was in a room. And then like I was the dog in the cage. And it started to, I was freaking out. So
And I have a high degree of empathy for individuals that are in your position, because there are very few people actually that fit into the way that society is structured and the expectations. And really, when you've got a child like you were, or even a young adult like you were, and there's nobody to hold your hand and teach you how to work with your specific unique energy, you're kind of out of luck. You know, it's like you got to stumble around and make a hell of a lot of mistakes before you finally find some direction to go in. So for you personally, what you want to be thinking about is, when you're doing something, when you're obsessing, is that obsession just the natural byproduct of your personality and you love it, which absolutely I see is the case for you, or are you in this moment using it to avoid something?
Which I also can do. Yeah.
So it's for you to decide which one is it right now in this moment. It's just, I don't want you to make an enemy of this entire other way of being just because you've put it all together and almost enmeshed everything.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, and it also can lead to some like very awkward like side qualities, like where I am so obsessive and compulsive that when I am in my passion and my fire, when people try to get in the way of that stream, I like erupt. So that's kind of where the reactivity question came from at the beginning. So I'm tying this whole interview in for New Way of Life.
Well, you can definitely work on your reactivity, but if I were in your position, I was you, I'm in your body's mine. Okay.
Yeah.
I would make it very clear to people as a boundary, essentially. And a boundary is not like a boundary is not about the other person, right? A boundary is about establishing a personal truth. So if I was in your position, I would establish a very strong boundary of expectation around the people who come into my field. This is how I am. This is how I work. So it's almost like giving them a framework to understand, okay, like now I know if I do this, this is what's going to happen and this is why. And then they can decide whether or not to say yes to that or no to that. But it's almost, remember how I said that like there's some places in our personal expansion path where we want to change something, but there are some where we powerfully need to accept something, and maybe something we're ashamed about. And that's actually the key to having better relationships. And then that puts the other person in one of those, okay, this is unworkable about this person. And the most successful people in relationships, the most successful people in life in general, are the people who are able to accept some of those things about themselves and put that on the table as what another person needs to accept or decide to opt out of with them. Wow. Rather than being like, oh, I'm going to, try to change this thing. I don't really want to change, but like, I think I should change it. Yep.
Hello, my name is Kyle and I am fire.
Basically. Yeah.
I just needed you to know.
Oh, I have so many places to go, but I think when you were talking, it made me think about is, because I've had this thought before, because I see this appearing in the same kind of people. Is codependency and addiction, are they the same animal? Like, it seems to me that everyone I know that gets clean from drugs or alcohol turns to codependency, has struggles with relationships where they become the next addiction.
Yeah, because the pain that is at the root of both conditions originates in the same place and from the same experience. So something to understand is, so when people, let's say that when people are more in their addictive patterns, they're more in a narcissistic way of being, right? What we call a classically narcissistic way of being. But remember how I explained that narcissism and codependency have their roots in the dysfunctional home. So they're just both narcissistic strategies to deal with other people. And this is why, like, I'm interested, in fact, in narcissism being taken out of the DSM as a disorder, and instead it being recognized that codependency and narcissism are relational strategies. So what you're seeing is just that, a person may let go of an addiction, but they still have not learned a different way of having relationships.
Yeah. What would be?
Oh, wait, I know where we need to go with that. Okay, so I got where we need to go with that. So you're going to notice, because they are strategies, that based on this relationship or that relationship or what's going on in your life right now, you're either going to behave more codependent or more narcissistic in a relationship if those are the only ways you know how to have a relationship.
Oh.
Wow. Yeah. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah. So what's the breakthrough there?
The breakthrough is to be able to have oneself and have the other person too.
Mm.
So it's essentially, there's many practices that you could put into play so as to establish that within relationships, but you have to be able to tap into your authentic personal truth and
Yeah.
learn how to bring that into relationship without letting go of it and without bulldozing the other person.
It's especially hard too because of the addictive personality. So it's like I am so good on my own, right? Like I have my passion, my fire. It's easy. I just follow it, the flow, that river you talked about, it just goes. And then when I get in a relationship, I'm like, I connect, and then I struggle with allowing that channel to just flow because I'm giving some of it over here, and then
Can I challenge you a little bit?
please.
Okay, my challenge is going to be that this intensive personality that you have has literally nothing to do with what you just described.
Okay.
You've got everything enmeshed. You got to separate it out. The way that you're behaving in relationship has nothing to do with this. In fact, I have watched individuals that come from more your personality side of the spectrum, and when they profoundly understand how to have relationship, they are so good at it because they're so active. There's no passiveness in their system. And what really, especially on the male side, really damages relationships is when males are in their passive mode relative to the woman in their life, especially, or if they're in a gay relationship, to the man in their life. It's like passiveness does not benefit a physical male, and especially in a male-female relationship, it does not benefit the female.
Could
So
you give an example of passive, just so I'm following?
Passive is like, well, my wife's unhappy with me, and I see that she's unhappy with me, but I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, and I'm not really going to like put any energy or action into changing anything. And so many men, especially nowadays when masculinity is quite frankly being stripped from men, so many men fall into that passive pattern. And I'm telling you, it's a recipe for hell, because what happens is that he's, in doing so, in not being active, he's not actually providing any leadership or containment for the woman in his life. And as a result, she feels like all of the pressure is on her. And when a female feels like all the pressure is on her and she has no containment, she basically masculinizes herself, and she becomes armored. Even the tissues of her body become armored. She starts to feel like she has to lead everything. And essentially her nervous system upregulates, which is not a good thing. So this is an uptight female who's like constantly feeling like she has to control everything. So that's why I'm saying that, like, almost that nature that you have, that intensive sort of forward moving active energy, once you learn how to have relationships, you will excel at that, in fact.
Well, so I think my observation is that I become not passive, almost overactive, to the point where I end up caring too much, and then I'm thinking too much about that. And
about the relationships?
Well, just like wanting things to be good. Like, just, I know that probably sounds crazy. I kind of regret saying that, but yeah, no. So it's just like, yeah, like I just get invested and my flow will go in that direction as a focus area.
Yeah,
and
that's
I almost over want everything to be perfect so that I can flow easier over here.
Well, so what you just said is that I do it as a so that. Now, if you approach if you approach any relationship from the perspective of, I'm going to try to make this good with you so that I can go focus elsewhere, that so that I can go focus elsewhere is going to, in and of itself, be perceived and felt. So all of a sudden, that will actually be perceived as an abandonment. And then your words are going to be perceived as a gaslight.
Oh,
that's number one. But number two, something that I do want to sort of call you on is that that intense focus towards trying to make the relationship, fix the relationship and everything, will go better for you if you're trying to profoundly understand the other person. Now, understanding is an interesting energy, because to understand, you have to almost sit back and open rather than step forward and project.
Yeah. Yep.
So for personality types like yours, projection is an issue. And then you're not going to be able to fix anything, because it's like you're not even sitting back and opening up so to understand what's really happening here.
Yeah. Yeah, but whenever I do that, whenever I sit back and just chill out.
No, it's not about chilling out. It's not about chilling out.
All right.
There's nothing passive about that.
Yeah.
Sitting back is not passive. It's, I'm making the decision to open up. Think about it like a martial artist. When the martial artist gets approached with an issue, he goes,
yeah.
That sitting back, where he's all of a sudden widening his senses, That's not a passive action.
Okay.
It's just the smartest action. You see?
It's like honor.
Yeah.
Well, so you brought up the word gaslighting, and I never actually have understood it. I
Okay.
hear it all the time, but I don't get it. I don't, I've heard a lot of people say it to different people, but I don't know if it actually makes sense how they're using it.
Okay, so a gaslight is anytime somebody perceives as if they're trying to be convinced of a reality that is the opposite of what they perceive. So the best way to understand gaslighting, do you understand anything about the origins of this or no?
I do. Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, so gaslighting essentially became a term because there was this like really early black and white film that was called Gaslight. And the reason is that it was a woman who was in a relationship with a crazy abusive man who was like psychologically messing with her to extreme degrees. And a lot of that messing with her involved like switching on and off lights when, yeah. Okay. So I want you to imagine, to understand gaslighting, let's imagine that I know that my bedspread is red. I know that because I sleep in it every night. But then I get home and all of a sudden I have a green bedspread on my bed. And you walk up to me and go, sweetie, oh my gosh, it's always been green.
Yeah.
That's a gaslight, because in that moment, my perception of reality is now being challenged in such an extreme way that it's almost like, am I insane? So gaslighting comes with that sensation of insanity. So a person can intentionally gaslight somebody else. You see this happen a lot in dysfunctional homes. Parents love to do this with children. I never said that. I don't know what you're talking about. I never said it. Right? You can also get unintentional gaslighting, whereby two people have entered into it like a different perceptual reality. And we know this. I mean, because if you interview people who have been in the same accident, they perceive different things. So they will gaslight each other. And not because they mean to, but each other's reality is being invalidated, right? You can also run into situations where people genuinely perceive things inaccurately. So the problem is we've got the spectrum of perception, and we use gaslighting as the term for when somebody's sort of perceived reality is being challenged in such an extreme way, it is to suggest that you don't perceive things accurately. Does that make sense?
Gaslighting, although it seems like it's overused in most instances, it probably is being used correctly, just based off of people perceiving reality differently.
It kind of depends on the situation.
Yeah.
I think that it's really beneficial to differentiate between intentional gaslighting and unintentional gaslighting.
Yeah.
Because like,
I like that. That sounds good.
This is why I mean this. You could be with a super abusive individual who is quite frankly using this as a form of getting away with their narcissistic strategies.
Right.
And they don't care the impact whatsoever. Okay? And they're just trying to distort somebody's own sense of personal truth to the degree that they can control it. But let's say that you're in a relationship with somebody who, on a subconscious level, is feeling really angry.
Yeah.
And you can see it and you know it. And that's the reality. But that person is like, I know what you're talking about. I'm not an angry person. I've never been an angry person. You can ask anyone I know. Now, technically, you're getting gaslit in that moment. But the person themselves has no access to the reality of their own emotional state. And therefore, it's not intentional gaslighting. And you see that in relationships like every day. Because people are, quite frankly, not particularly in touch with their own realities.
Well, so I want to just get real about it because, so many people are saying you gaslight, but I want to just say, like, I know for myself in our relationship, when we both get triggered, right? It's like our egos will grab onto our story that's in the best interest of us going to battle against each other. It's like, no, this is what I did, and that's what you did. And then it's like, but we're perceiving reality actually different to serve our egos. And so I will try to tell her, like, nope, that's not what happened. This is really what happened. So I'll but it's like, it's kind of gaslighting, but it seems like it's just kind of like a self-defense mechanism, I don't want to do it.
It's a self-defense mechanism. I mean, and what's best when you're in an argument, obviously, for conflict resolution is to agree upon facts. Yeah. It's very difficult when you can't agree upon facts.
So how would you bring that up? there's like a little quarrel going on, you know, a little banter, fun time, Saturday night, whatever, things are getting a little rowdy, and there's a disagreement, and it's like, I'm saying this is how it happened, you're saying this is how it happened. It's just like, all right, what are the facts?
Yeah, you need to sit down. It's basically can be an agreement if you're in a relationship. Let's sit down and agree upon the facts. We can literally write them down.
I like that.
And once you agree upon the facts, what you'll notice is that there are these two branches that come off of agreeing upon the facts. It's what we make it mean.
Yeah,
Now, this is actually usually what we're arguing about.
yeah. That is not a fact.
Yeah, I think well, it's leading me to think about that. I think that I have sort of overdeveloped a part of my personality that is defensive.
Yeah.
Because I will feel misunderstood, probably in the way of that it's been interpreted as something bad. And it could have been maybe admittedly a mistake, but just not to the level that it's being perceived, or and I find myself coming up against this over and over again and wanting to stop this as a pattern. And I wonder what you would have to say about like the importance of actually having the other person understand you, or maybe that you just
it's the importance of having the other person understand you is absolutely critical in a relationship. In fact, I want people to replace the word love with understand. Because to love something is simply to act in its best interests. Now, I'm not saying act in its best interest against your own, but to love something is to act in its best interest, is to include something as the self. And when you include something as part of you, you can't act against its best interest without hurting yourself at the same time, which is what makes love so incredibly powerful. So let's say that I love a jellyfish. This is my favorite example. If I love a jellyfish and I'm taking it as a part of me and I can't hurt it without hurting myself, I have to understand that jellyfish. Otherwise, I'm going to pick it up out of the water and hug it, and it's dead. So the reason why people have to replace the word love with understanding is because the minute that you try to understand somebody, meaning I'm looking at the jellyfish, I'm looking at its needs, I'm coming to an understanding of that as a being, I go, oh wait, it needs to be in water, I can't take it out of water. And you're all of a sudden doing the right thing. And when I'm doing the right thing for that thing, it actually feels loved because I'm acting in its best interests. So you absolutely have to be understood.
So if you're not feeling understood,
then nobody can, then what if I'm not feeling understood, what I'm really saying is, because you don't understand this, you are not going to act in my best interest. And because of it, you're a threat. And because of it, I'm panicking. And because of it, I'm defending myself against you.
So if you're not understood, you're not feeling like somebody else isn't going to act in your best interest. But if you want somebody to understand you, what would be the best way to go about that? Acting in that person's best interest?
I don't know, to help them. You like in that moment, if I'm the one in the relationship who feels, I mean, oftentimes it's both, but you can go back and forth. Let's say that I'm in a relationship argument and I'm feeling misunderstood. The first thing I do is to voice that. Right now, I don't feel like you're understanding me at all. Now, then the burden is on the other person to understand, meaning, and understanding is not passive. Understanding is, all right, just like I'm studying something, I want to get it. I want to get it. Okay. Now that's their burden. My burden is I'm going to help them. I'm not going to sit here and be like, well, I just expect it. No, like I'm literally going to anything I can give.
Yeah. Well, so then to the other side of that, so it's like, you know, she's saying that basically she's having a hard time because she feels like she's always being wronged, right? Or like I'm always thinking that she's wrong about something is what I meant to say. Well, what about how when you actually feel like somebody's doing something wrong, but they're always defensive, so it feels impossible to communicate with them? How do you actually convey that in a way that makes any positive progress?
Why is it important? So my question is, why is it important to have them understand that they're wrong rather than for you to understand why it is that they're doing what they're doing, and potentially from that understanding to have a conversation about a potential better way of going about it.
So what about if I ask that question, why is this happening? And then it's not, and it's still causing defense.
Well, that we can work on that defensiveness one of two ways, right? We can work on it on the individual level. Let's say I had somebody who was not in a relationship and I could not work with their partner on behaving in ways that were less threatening. I was just working on them and what they're making it mean. Oftentimes what's happening is there's a shame-based reaction. So the defense you're watching is in fact not a true representation of what's occurring within them. A lot of people who are on that sort of that side of always feeling like they're the wrong one in the relationship, they down deep do feel like they're always the wrong one. So there's undealt with levels of shame in their being that has occurred. And so, you know, in that moment, they aren't even really convinced. They're just trying to convince you as a reflection of them trying to convince themselves.
Wow. So it'd almost be like softening it. Like I don't actually think you did anything wrong or something like that, to kind of like take down that guard. And then
if you want to take the guard down, so that's me talking to, this is if I do have the other person in the room. If I do have the other person in the room, you got to behave in a way that's less of a threat. So basically, when I come at somebody and I'm like, this is wrong, right? What I'm doing is,
I love that face. That was so good.
What I'm doing in that moment is I'm closing myself down to the other person, because wrong suggests I'm very rigid. Okay, so that suggests I'm not open to your truth. I've already decided, and essentially I'm throwing a strike to say you should feel shame, because like because of socialization, we've got wrong linked to I'm bad, linked to all these consequences for being bad. And so that's why the threat is like, you know.
Yeah. So what's the way to approach that?
Well, if it's me in a relationship, I don't use the word wrong. I don't even use it ever. Like at all. I literally, like, this is about me and the other person. I make it about me and my truth and you and your truth, not about what's objectively right or wrong.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that creates more of an opening for a person to feel like I can have me. And when I say you are wrong, they can't have themselves, because it suggests that any truth they have that falls outside what I've already decided is already invalid.
So what if I say, I just want to understand you, right? And then the response doesn't feel like it resonates, and I'm still left with some sort of thing.
Keep asking questions. I'm telling you, the majority of the problems you're getting into are not problems because of like what you're making it mean right now. They're problems because of the overall energy and tone you're going at things with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm asking, because we want to.
It's like this. If I don't understand, no matter what you're doing, I can continue to ask questions. Let's say, based on your question, you may take me this direction. Based on that question, I may want to open this door. I can keep asking questions. And if I do so from an attitude like, I really do want to understand that. So let me ask you this question. Like, when you feel me and you hear me there, that's different than me being like, I want to understand you. I want to understand you.
I'm never like that. Never like that, Teal.
So that's the shadow. That's the shadow of that type of energy, right? You've got all these benefits and all these sort of downsides to anything, right? So that intensity that you go at things with in a relationship, this is like manifestation of it. And now what you're going to do is you're going to put somebody, especially somebody who's not really in touch with their personal truth quickly, you're going to put them in the position of almost shutting down. Because and it depends who you're with. See, if you're with a woman who really powerfully was able to have her personal truth her whole life and whatever, you're going to get into like out of the universe fights with that type of with a female. I don't imagine the relationship would last particularly long, but let's say that if you're in a relationship with a female who was not allowed to have a lot of personal truth and was very much taught to be like a good girl, then what will happen when you approach her with that type of energy is a shutdown, because like you're saying, I want to understand, I need to understand. All of a sudden you're like, I need something from you, give it to me now. And what if she's like, well, I need to think about it, you know? And so it causes like a complete like all systems off paralysis, you know?
Yeah. So I was raised in an environment where it was like the good girl, you know, like you're saying. So that's why I kind of am the way I am. So I naturally would like to soften and not be so programmed to believe that, like, is this making sense what I'm saying?
No, because
No.
it's almost like you're trying to say that you were in that position of the good of like being
No,
allowed.
no. So I'm trying to say it without necessarily like like specifying, but you know, like basically my upbringing was dominant,
Yep.
father,
Yep.
submissive, you know. So that's kind of what I've seen, and it's kind of what I'm trying to work my way out of. Yeah.
That's good. I mean, it's very good to clear up your ancestral patterns, like
Yeah.
what you're describing.
Yeah.
Like you have the perfect environment for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So
Yeah, this has been so
yeah,
wonderful and
favorite interview ever. This was
so
awesome.
good.
Yeah.
That makes me happy.
Like acts Teal come true.
Give us a couple successful some keys for a successful relationship before we go.
Ooh.
Oh, okay. So we covered deeply understanding the person, almost replacing "I love you" with I want to understand you.
Mm,
You have to understand the other person, honestly, also as an antidote to fear. So remember, we were talking about the fact that when we get threatened in a relationship, we get these narcissistic aspects of our being that step forward. They do so because of this position of fear. And if we deeply understand something, we no longer fear it. It's the reason why people who really understand sharks don't really have a big problem swimming with them. And the rest of us are watching the Instagram stories going,
yeah.
so understand, right? That's number one. Number two is to develop trust.
Mm,
Trust is literally acting in somebody's best interest and vice versa.
mm,
You have to make an absolute act of that. It is the holy grail of relationships, but most people hear trust and it's abstract. And trust is not something that should ever just be given or ever just be expected. It is something that is a work in progress every day of your relationship, because that is the heart of security in a relationship. The best partnerships are between people who really feel like they can rely upon the other person to have their best interests,
mm,
not despite themselves. That's what the win-win is about. Can I trust the person I'm in a relationship with, whether it's a friend, family member, or partner, to essentially find a win-win? Okay, so that trust is the holy grail of relationships. What else? I would say for relationships, developing, that sense of safety, which is again about that acting in the best interests. Compatibility is, I can't understate this, and I know that a lot of people hate this because people would love to think that love triumphs over all, but it does not, in fact. And by love, I mean this positive affectional feeling that we have for people. I don't really think that's love. It's not love. We're just using that unfortunate word to describe that. But compatibility is absolutely necessary for a relationship. That's honestly the only way that we can play a win-win game. Because if my best interests are incompatible with your best interests, we're kind of screwed, right?
yeah.
So compatibility is super important.
Mm,
The other thing that I would say is transaction, actually, and a lot of people are like, "Wait, what?" Yes, actually, one of the keys to a good relationship is a healthy transaction. There's always an energy exchange in a relationship, and what I want people to do is to separate that from the concept of love. Like we've almost got these two different branches, totally separate branches. Over here, we've got the love element, which is I take you as a part of me. I act in your best interest. That's over here, right? The transactional element is the energy exchange of a relationship. This is what makes it interesting for us to get into business with this person. And by business, I don't mean this cold cut, whatever it is, but it's like every relationship, let's say, for example, and there's many, but let's say in every relationship, let's say for a male, he's providing some kind of containment. He's providing some kind of, providership, potentially, like whatever it is. And, the female, for example, in that relationship is providing like a safe place for him to be, maybe some caretaking needs. I mean, I could just go on forever, right? But there's always an energy exchange. And to get into those energy exchanges in a very conscious way is one of the best ways to ensure that you have a successful and healthy relationship.
Beautiful.
Because when dissatisfaction in a relationship goes down, in fact, is when that transactional element in the relationship starts to get disrupted.
Yeah. Wow. This was awesome. This is one I'm going to watch a bunch of times. Try to practice. So hopefully, we can do this again sometime. We'll check in with you on how we're doing.
More questions.
All right.
Thank you so much,
Teal.
Teal. Sending love to everybody.
Thank you so much.
One final question. We would just love to find out how our members can support you, how we can support you, what you're up to in the world, and any offerings that you have.
The best way to find me is on tealswan.com. So all you need to do is remember my name. On there, we've got all the events that I'm offering. We've got all the products that I'm producing, books, like everything. And also every single Saturday, I'm releasing a new video and have for the last 12 years, in fact, on YouTube. So I'm producing new content on every topic that I can think of under the sun. So weekly, there's like new stuff. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll check it out. Everybody, hope to see you on Teal's YouTube on Saturdays. Thank you, everybody.